Welcome home. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively taking the show on the road. It is the Maryland Crab Cake Tour presented by our friends at the Maryland Lottery. I have the Pac-Man scratch-offs. These have been a pretty lucky batch. Taking some pictures. I was up at Greenmount Bowl and Greenmount Station last Wednesday. Talked a lot of horse racing. It is Kentucky Derby week. Make sure you're listening out for that. Past, present, future. Had a really, really great, lengthy chats with David Richardson as well as Alan Foreman, involved in Maryland racing and the Stronach and going back to DeFrancis and old memories and old names that were brought my way as well. At one point, he said Jack Klugman used to come to the Alibi breakfast, and I told the whole story about the Alibi breakfast, which begat the Liars luncheon and all that. And then I realized, like, the 25th anniversary, Jack Klugman is referenced as Oscar Madison. So it all comes full circle. It is a racing week, Kentucky Derby week. We're going to present that. Also, our friends at the Liberty Pure Solutions putting on the Maryland Crab Cake Tour, keeping my water delicious. I've got it poured right here, right now, so I'm down with that, as well as Jiffy Lube Multi-Care. I am wearing my Curio purple. It's, probably the only time first off, it's a little long sleevish, and I like me like a concert jersey kind of feel to it. But this football thing, it's about to go away again. We got about 2 minutes to talk about these kids, and we're on the Nestor, whatever his name is, not me, the pitcher from the Yankees, and who's going to be in the bullpen, and Luke, it's still football season here, right? I mean, even though we're into May and we're going to have little mini this and passing that and mandatory this, and certainly better drama than we had this time last year.
It's always football season. I mean, and that's not a Baltimore thing. That's a United States thing, right? I mean, the NFL is the biggest professional sport in America, and the second biggest is the NFL offseason. I mean, it's how it is. The ratings reflect that. The fact that you have hundreds of thousands of people in Detroit basically standing there watching players be picked, not watching a game, but watching players be picked. And everyone had a great time. So what do I know about that? But certainly a big weekend for the Ravens. I mean, the first round pick's always exciting, right? I mean, Nate Wiggins, good value there, certainly going to help them as far as boosting their depth in the secondary where, their starters were established. After that, it was kind of like, who's going to be the backup? Who's going to be the number 3 corner, all that. So, but once you get beyond the first round, I think for most people, especially with it coinciding with the Orioles off to the start they are, bullpen concerns aside, it is a little bit of a different dynamic. But for the Ravens, I think they felt really good about their draft in terms of the value. You and I have spent a lot of time talking about the offensive line and what they did and did not do. And we'll continue to talk about that because, yeah, rookies will be running around in shorts this weekend at Owings Mills, and OTAs will start late next month, and we'll be out there a few times here and there, meeting media. But football players in shorts, especially offensive line play, that's not telling you a whole lot. So that's going to continue to be a question. But I think Eric DeCosta, John Harbaugh, David Blackburn, the entire front office scouting department, I think they were pleased with what they were able to come away with. What stands out immediately is fortifying their depth at cornerback, as we mentioned with Wiggins, not just him, but TJ Tampa in the 4th round, who a lot of people thought might be a 2nd round pick. So they did that. They added another edge rusher in Adisa Isaac out of Penn State. Similar traits to Odafe Owe, but maybe a little more, not maybe, definitely more production in terms of sacks in the Big Ten and at Penn State. So an interesting pick there. You and I have talked already about Roger Rosengarten. To me, he's the short-term key to this draft class, right? I mean, they kind of sort of need him to play week 1, right? They kind of sort of need him to play as a rookie, whereas that's not necessarily the case with the rest of these guys. But, you go down the list and, we can go one by one. I think all of these picks to some degree or another make sense. I think all of these picks, even if value was what the pick was driven by, I think all of these picks you can see where, okay, that makes sense. Okay, they needed that. Right on down to Nick Samac in the 7th round out of Michigan State, a guy who started multiple years at center. Okay, he's not going to, he's got to make the team first. We know a 7th round pick is never a given to even make the team, but ideally, he might be able to be Tyler Linderbaum's cheap, dependable backup for the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, who knows? So even with the 7th round pick, you can kind of sort of see what they envision with each of these picks. And now it's just a matter of getting them on the field and seeing if what you project, what you scouted, what you hope they can be will actually come to fruition. We know it's not going to be the case for all 9. That's just reality. But with some of their best draft classes, they'll get some use out of 6 or 7 of these guys, at least for the next couple years.
Luke, we'll get to the Atlanta Falcons thing because I've got the quote ready to go with you, and we can talk about that. But as I make light of that, and I don't even have to say it out loud, that we're like laughing at the Falcons and overdrafting for our position. I mean, we sat here 2 years ago and they drafted a safety after they signed a safety, and we tried to make sense of that, even though you're like, well, on the inside, they would make sense of that. The thing about the Ravens against the tide and everything else we've talked about here, and we talked a little bit about the Orioles and like, will Elias be here when Adley Rutschman's in year 8? You sort of hope so, and that works out with new management and all of those things. But you can manage your team differently if you're managing thinking, I'm going to be here through the duration of, let's say, Lamar Jackson or Steve Bisciotti's tenureship as owner, or however many 3 to 5 more years that John Harbaugh wants to coach and the way he wants to coach. And you feel like Monken probably is going to be here a couple of years now to go with Lamar. So you start to put these pieces together and you draft differently, you think differently. And even when they go away from Zeitler and Moses and veteran players, and last year we talked about Calais Campbell, and that's always going to be the case. And even drafted guys like Patrick Queen, that is a pick they had that they've converted now into, well, we'll figure out. Hope he plays well, and we'll get a late 3rd, 4th round pick, whatever it would be. They're so good at this and the science of it that once they get into the weekend and they identify their needs, we always sit here on Monday and say, well, they need a wide receiver. Well, yeah, they'll need but the guard thing is a little weird that they didn't jump more in, and it speaks more to where the draft is, but it also speaks to them having pro personnel out and Kokinis and these guys saying, well, you got this guy with a cap issue here and that guy, we're going to keep an eye. One of these 5 guys will pop and we'll get a player.
Yeah. I mean, sure. You're always looking at, look, every draft class, every roster is a puzzle, and it's not about having to find the exact perfect piece every time. It's having the right combinations. We talked about this a little bit when you and I were at Fadley's late last week, breaking down the Nate Wiggins pick. And one of the things that we talked about, and what Eric DaCosta talked about on that Thursday night, was he felt when you look at where they look at the analytics, they look at trends, they look at how the board stacks, they look at draft rankings, all those different things, and they try to anticipate when there are going to be those certain runs at each position, right? Obviously, the quarterback run in the 1st round was where the first run that we saw, but then we saw O-line. We saw corners earlier in the 2nd round, and that's one reason why the Ravens thought, hey, there's probably a good chance that we can still find a good offensive tackle that we feel can start sooner than later. Whether Rosengarten's going to start week 1, again, we'll have to see. But the point is, they felt more confident that they could get the offensive tackle in the 2nd round if they took Nate Wiggins. If they reached for one of the offensive tackles that, frankly, at that point would have had a 2nd round grade, if they did that at 30, they could have done that. Teams reach. The Ravens have reached for players before, even though they'll never tell you that. They have. But the point was, if they did that, they didn't feel as confident that they'd be able to get a cornerback then in round 2 or 3 that would be able to help them. Obviously wasn't going to be as good as Nate Wiggins, but it's a matter of, can you get someone that's going to help you, or is it going to be a developmental guy that is going to be either inactive or exclusively a special teams player? So
this is no different than your rotisserie draft or your fantasy league. Once there's a run, you better get somebody in the seat, like literally. And I don't say I feel panic for them on behalf of the offensive line. I do think with Voorhees in Cleveland, they feel like we could go play this weekend if we had to. Maybe not well, but it's not like they're maybe where the
Well,
Orioles are with a closer, where they really don't have one right now. Like they don't have a guy they didn't know can play that position.
and this is where we also go back to expectation, right? You can draft someone and that guy could end up being a Hall of Fame player. Does that mean that guy's going to be a Hall of Fame player in year one? Most often not. Now, someone like Ray Lewis, okay, Ray kind of looked like a Hall of Famer from the first day he stepped on the field in Memorial Stadium. But in most cases, it takes time. And offensive line specifically, how many examples have we seen now over the last 10 years? For every Ronnie Stanley, who, by the way, was picked 6th overall, right? He wasn't a late first round guy. For every guy that you'll find that ends up playing right away, you're going to find others who struggle or don't really get on the field. I mean, Ben Powers 2 years ago, right? He got, last offseason, he got paid big time by the Broncos. Going into that season, he was regarded as a question mark for the Ravens because he hadn't really developed that quickly. So I think for the Ravens, you got to the third round, fourth round, and I think that's kind of this, beyond that, you're really looking at lottery tickets, right? I mean, especially for O linemen, you get beyond the fourth round, you're kind of looking at guys that are
Don't tell
exclusively
Ryan
developmental.
Jensen that. Come on now.
Ryan Jensen he'd be the first to tell you he was a developmental guy. I mean, he was cut even by the Ravens and was on their practice squad. I mean, he was hurt at the beginning. Point is, those late round guys, you're never counting on to play right away. So if you're the Ravens, you're looking at your board, third round, Adisa Isaac, edge rusher, they end up taking him. It was regarded as being good value. I think most people thought he would go right around then. Some people thought he might go a little bit earlier than that. Certainly wasn't a guy that people were talking about as a fifth rounder. And then you're saying, why did they take him in the third round? So good value there. Fourth round picks. Tez Walker out of North Carolina, kind of looks like could have a chance to be a poor man's Torrey Smith. He's raw. He's got to refine his route running, but probably has a chance to get on the field as their number 4 receiver who maybe runs some go routes that maybe Lamar finds some chemistry with, unlike throwing to Rashad Bateman last year. But that's another conversation.
All the names of the Duvernays, the Tylan Wallaces,
Sure.
and all we can throw those guys. This the last 5 years that there's always a dart, and the guy will catch a touchdown pass somewhere along the way, right? He'll get on the
probably.
field.
I mean, unless he just can't. I mean, sometimes they just can't play. Like Jordan Lastly, I think was a 5th round pick. He couldn't play a lick. Jaleel Scott, who they drafted in the 4th round, he couldn't play a lick. So
I love how you remember
happen.
the guys that can't play a lick, and I just try to figure out well, I'll give you a funny story. I'll just interject this since we're talking football with sort of a sad ending. I lost one of my executive producers last week, very, very tragically. His name was Lonnie Willems. And Lonnie's the reason we love Pequod's Pizza in Chicago. He was a cop in Chicago. And I was literally doing the 25th anniversary documentary, and I was looking through some things, and he very famously, and you can go to our social media and see this, with his handwriting and a typewriter of some kind. He had some computer that typed in about 6-point font in this DPI thing where he put all the names of guests on these mini discs, little square mini, smaller than the Pac-Man ticket I'm holding, like a little bit smaller than that even. And square mini disc was something nobody had but nerds like us in the industry. And he put all these names. Hey, dude, it said Mark Clayton on it. And I'm like, hold on, this was 1999, 2000. And then I saw Duper right next to it. And I'm like, oh, it was the other Mark Clayton. It wasn't that Mark Clayton. So there's different Mark Claytons even in my life once you get to be this old. But I remember all the draft picks, and any thought of a wide receiver at that point being more than a returner, I'm skeptical of. Even Travis Taylor, whom I love, and Mark Clayton, who I love, and even Hollywood Brown, who I liked. It's the hardest thing in the world picking these wide receivers, and that's why when they're picking them, you're like, well, they're going to take a try at it, and you have to because you'll spank them in the offseason if they don't. But my expectations are always a little lower with wide receivers. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, well, I wasn't I don't disagree. You have to take swings though, because you see what the talk. We were talking in a previous segment about starting pitching and paying Corbin Burns. You see what wide receivers are making in free agency now. The deal the Ravens just signed Rashad Bateman to, who even if Bateman never elevates beyond what he is right now, probably isn't bad value. I mean, that's just how the going rate for top shelf wide receivers now is $30 million a year. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So you
That's
better
$2
take some.
million a game. And by the way, you said a poor man's Torrey Smith. That ain't a poor man.
Sure. But to go back to the point I was making at that, with those third and fourth round guys, and the other one being TJ Tampa, the Iowa State corner, who, I think is a really interesting player, might be the best value pick they made compared to, and I'm not sitting here saying I studied rounds 1 through 7 and I intimately am aware of every player in this draft, but lots of people thought he was more of a second or third round pick, outside corner, but some people think maybe he's a guy who transitions to safety. And if there's one roster need beyond the offensive line that I look at right now, third safety, who is it? Because you want to be able to move Kyle Hamilton around, right? You don't want to change that. My gosh, I mean, he's maybe the best defensive Swiss Army knife in the National Football League at this point in time. So who's that Geno Stone? I have no idea who that is on the roster right now. I don't think it's Ardarius Washington. I don't think it's, unless they're moving a corner over there.
It also, that's a very smart position, right?
Yeah.
Like that is a position where you need a Chuck Clark kind of, you need a guy that can wear the green dot.
Stone.
He
doesn't have to wear the green dot, but you need someone who
somebody's capable of seeing the defense multiply and reading keys and always making the right decision on reads, because that's how you get killed. You just get killed. You started saying, well, this guy's not ready and that guy's not ready. That's probably exactly what they're saying out in the building about, like, I cannot trust Russell Wilson on third down out there in Pittsburgh. Can't have that with 2 minutes left to go in the game. We get a breakdown, a communication breakdown. And I think that that's the hardest part of replacing these players, especially in the back end there, is you want to have the pieces in place and have a full practice and have them really get comfortable with each other in that defense.
No question about it. But, TJ Tampa, I think, is a really interesting potential piece for them. Again, doesn't mean week one of his rookie year, but going back to the original point I was making, because we were talking about the guards, I think if you're Eric DeCosta, if you're any team that has a specific need, but then you look at the board and you say, okay, we could draft a guard there, but this guy's we have as a better talent. We have him as higher on our board. And here's the reality. When we're taking a guy in the third or fourth round, well, you know what? We took Tyree Phillips as a third rounder back in 2020. And that guy, they eventually gave up on him, but he couldn't really play. We took Ben Cleveland in 2021, and we think he might be ready to play now, but he sure wasn't ready to play those first couple years. Point is, yes, they could have drafted a guard in the third or fourth round, but if you're talking strictly through a 2024 lens, is that guy better than what you have on the roster right now for this year? Probably not. So that, again, this goes back to when you are filling 3 spots on your starting offensive line from a year ago. You have some incumbents. I'll sign off on 1 or 2 of them, maybe being able to do the job, but you've got 3, not just maybes, 3 complete unknowns right now. And that's assuming Ronnie Stanley is a known, and we've already talked about even that being problematic. So the point is, you kind of get to the middle rounds where the Ravens were, and I think they made the decision to say, you know what? Instead of reaching for a guard that probably isn't going to be ready to play for us this year anyway, this guy's a better value, and this guy might be able to help. Adisa Isaac might be able to. He might step in and be the third or fourth member of their outside linebacker rotation from day one. I don't think that's impossible. And part of that also speaks to not having a ton of proven depth there. And that's another.
Well, Tyus Bowser came on in sort of that role, through time, right? I mean, through
3 years into it.
Yeah.
And he was a second round pick. So again, you get to these, everyone, and especially the draft nerd. And I say that with affinity. I don't say that to be derogatory. The draft Twitter, Ravens draft nuts, not just the media, but fans. you look at those draft picks and you try to envision the best case scenario with all of them. And you know that the best case scenario hopefully plays out with your first round pick. Maybe will play out with one or two other guys. A couple other guys will be decent backups. And you'll have a couple guys who either won't make the team at all or they'll be gone after a year. I mean, that's just how it works. And that's a pretty good draft class, mind you. You know, that you're not going to hit on everyone. So that's why their thought, the way they approached this was we're going to take the best players available, and they still aligned with needs. You know, I didn't even get to them, but fifth round pick Rasheen Ali from Marshall. You know, he had a biceps injury at the Senior Bowl. You know, should be okay to go by the time training camp comes around. You know, Keaton Mitchell's not going to be ready week one, most likely. You know, he tore his ACL in mid-December. So you have Henry, of course, as your feature back. You have Justice Hill, but you're going to need another back. So they added Rasheen Ali, and we'll see where he fits. Maybe he's the eventual replacement to Justice Hill, who's in a contract year. Maybe he doesn't play very much other than just on special teams, but you take a running back in the fifth round. And, you know, you kind of, again, if you're drafting exclusively for need, look, it might work out sometimes, but over the long haul, that's going to be a losing proposition. The teams that do this the best, the Ravens, other teams that you regard as teams that have drafted well for not just recently, not just the last 5 years, but for the last 20 years, are the teams that see the value and maximize the value. And look, that doesn't mean that it never converges with need. Of course, you're drafting for need, but you want the best player available that's going to fit a need for you.
Well,
And I
and the
think
need is
this
always
draft,
special teams in John Harbaugh's mind. Maybe that's changing a little bit in regard to kickoff, but certainly not in regard to punt.
I mean, it's
Um,
always
yeah,
part of it. Yeah, it's
yeah.
always part of it, and especially when you get to day three, right? I mean, day three. That I mean, Rasheen Ali's going to play special teams.
Those guys
You
have
know,
to be athletes. Those guys have to be dogs, as they say.
yeah, you know, in the seventh round, they took the safety Sanusi Kane, who didn't even go to the combine. You know, from Purdue. Eric DaCosta actually compared him to Haruki Nakamura, who never really played a whole lot defensively, but was a heck of a special teams player for them for 3 or 4 years. So you need some of that. But the point is, again, bringing it back to the offensive line conversation, and you mentioned guard. Once you got beyond round one, round two, and even round three, at that point, you're drafting your next Ben Powers. You're drafting your next Ben Cleveland. You're drafting your next Ben Bredesen. You're drafting your next Tyree Phillips. You're drafting your next Big Sala. You know, you're drafting your next Daniel Faalele. And look, some of those guys eventually developed into pretty good players. But we know in most of those cases of the names I just mentioned, none of them really played well year one. So that's,
Orlando Brown
again,
got on the field, right? I mean, after
he
that
did.
horrific, so there
Yeah, I
are
mean, there are
cases.
exceptions.
Yeah.
There are exceptions, sure, no question. But even he was a guy from a tape standpoint. People talked about him potentially being a first round pick. He tested so horrendously that he fell to the third round. So, yeah, there are some cases like that. But generally speaking, this is why the Ravens did what they did. And look, they could turn out to be totally wrong. There could be a guard that they passed on in the fourth round who ends up being a Pro Bowler by his second year and is a day one starter. I mean, it happens. It's not what you should be counting on. You know, it's the exception to the rule. So it does happen, but I think they felt that coming away with a guard at that point of the draft probably was not going to be better than what they have on their roster already, guys that have already been in the program, guys who are already familiar with the offense, guys who have already been working from a strength and conditioning standpoint. So, we're going to see how that plays out. Look, they have absolutely opened themselves up to some second guessing here. I mean, that's why I said in one of our previous segments that, as time has gone on here, I do wonder if maybe the Morgan Moses trade ends up being a step too far. Maybe you should have held on to him. And if Rosengarten unseats him come week 6, then great. Or if Rosengarten is so great during training camp, you could trade Morgan Moses at the end of the preseason and probably could have gotten a similar pick swap kind of deal out of it. So, we'll see. It could work out to be fine. And I'll give them the benefit of the doubt in the sense that they have been able to develop some mid to later round offensive line talent. But as I also pointed out, they did have an issue replacing Marshall Yanda that first year. And that's why they got Kevin Zeitler the following year. And they did have an issue not accounting for the Ronnie Stanley injury enough when they got Villanueva, who was done. I mean, was not good.
By the way, they still haven't
So
accounted for it, right? Because they didn't, like they didn't really draft for it this week either, right? So
sure. Oh yeah. Well, and that's why I said. I mean, this is already, there's already some questions here. Heaven forbid if Ronnie Stanley can't stay on the field again, because then, okay, McCary moves over to the left side, but then what if Rosengarten plays like a rookie, which
yeah,
is
no matter
entirely
what, you have a
reasonable.
rookie right tackle. No matter
I
how
mean,
good he's a rookie right tackle.
yeah, yeah. So,
Right.
they didn't really draft. I mean, I know some people have talked about Rosengarten in terms of at Washington he was protecting Penix, who was a lefty. So, right tackle is kind of is protecting the blind side. So some people have said, well, does that mean he could be a left tackle? I don't really think so. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but the point is they need him. If he's not a plug and play guy, then I'm really, really uneasy with where they are with their
You're
offensive
gonna
line.
write like a whole Luke column on the importance of that one pick, right? That's like
I think that's the pivot. Look, Nate Wiggins could end up being their next Ring of Honor corner. And let's be clear. Look at the history of their first round corners. Dwayne Starks, check. Chris McAllister, check plus, right? Ring of Honor guy. Jimmy Smith, check. Even if the injuries, he didn't fulfill the potential that he had. He was still a really good player for a long time. Marlon Humphrey, 3-time Pro Bowler, check plus. So history tells us that they've hit on Nate Wiggins. They'll hit on Nate Wiggins, and the value tells you they should hit on Nate Wiggins. I mean, he's that kind of talent. But for me, the short term, there's no one more important than Roger Rosengarten to the 2024 team. I mean, I think he's that consequential here. I'm not saying he has to come in and be great. He doesn't. But can he come in and be ready to play week one, or even if even a scenario where McCary starts the first 3 weeks and then he's ready to play by October 1st. If that scenario plays out and he's solid and looks like he can even be better than that, then boy, then this draft it did the job in the short term, and then we'll see how the long term plays out. I mean, that's always an unknown. But for 2024, yeah, I feel like Rosengarten, the second round pick, is yeah, I feel like that's more pivotal than even Nate Wiggins. I mean, Nate Wiggins, I think is going to play, and I think he'll at times play a lot, but they do have Marlon Humphrey and Brandon Stevens ahead of him in the pecking order. So it's not like he has to play 100% of the snaps. Rosengarten, if he's not ready to play at right tackle, and we're talking about Faalele, or we're talking about Patrick McCary, or we're talking about them having to go out and try to make a move for a veteran, which I still think, like I said, if I had to bet a dollar one way or the other, I think you're still going to see something along those lines at some point, even if it's just a depth piece. But, I think they're counting a lot on Rosengarten. And again, I like the prospect. This isn't me knocking him, but it's a lot to ask. The 62nd overall pick, an offensive lineman drafted 62nd overall to play week one of his rookie year. I mean, you quite often do not see that. Maybe he'll buck the trend, and maybe Eric DeCosta will absolutely deserve his flowers for that. Or it could play out as most guys in that area of the draft do, O-line wise. Usually they need a year or two. So I know the one thing about him is he does need to get a little stronger. I think that's one thing that scouts and pundits have said about him, but moves his feet well. Seems like a perfect fit from a zone blocking standpoint. Seems like a guy that can hold up in 5-man protection when you're dropping back to pass and not having to keep extra blockers in. So he checks boxes. I'm not second guessing the pick. I'm second guessing any expectation that he's necessarily going to be ready week one, but we'll see. Maybe he will be. And if that's the case, if he can be like Orlando Brown as a rookie, then they'll be fine. They'll be fine there. And then it's a matter of the guards. But until we see that, we're all doing the same thing, including the Ravens, which is trying to project on a lot of unknown about these young players.
Who do we play week one? When's
We don't know yet. We'll know soon.
We're going to gather 750,000 people waiting around to figure out whether we're going to Mexico City or whatever the hell we're going to do, or what? We're not going to Brazil. I found that out. They're sending the Eagles. They need to send the animals down to the Amazon, so they're sending the Eagles fans down there. Is what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we should be. I would assume Probably not. I guess not this week, but maybe next week is the schedule release. What, it's been right around the first or
I
second
got
week
the
of
dates
May.
for you. Ready? Okay, 23 it was May 11th. In
Okay.
22 it was May 12th. In
Okay.
21
So
it was May 12th. In 20 it was May 7th. Now this would show you that I have a little
that's
bit
the
of silver
COVID
coming
year.
in today, right? Before that, April 17, April 19, April 20, April 14, April 21, April 23, April 18. It was always before the draft. So if people are wondering who they're playing week one, I guess I made my point, which is for anybody that followed the Ravens the first 25 years, it was sort of out by now, and we would know we're
Mhm.
playing the Bengals. They have they milk this, don't they, Lucas? They milked it.
Well, they didn't have a tent pole event for May, so now they have one. I mean, I don't think we're going to get to a point where they start have a host city for the schedule release. I don't think we'll get that crazy because, oh my gosh, if we do, it just says so much about us as a society, I think.
Can they get
But
Mary J. Blige to play it? If they can, I'll go.
hey, that's okay. That's okay. But yeah, we
Get it
we should be
percolating.
getting it.
That's what I'm
And
saying.
obviously, the COVID year was when this started in terms of pushing the schedule back. And I think they realized, hey, let's wait until after the draft because then we can have another 3 hour special and pop a rating on ESPN and NFL Network, and our TV partners are happy, and we can spike the ball in May when before we didn't, other than just OTAs. So yeah, so we're waiting on that next. But at this point, draft is complete. I want to be very clear. All my questions about the offensive line aside, I don't have a problem with their draft. I think they got good value. I think this has the potential to be a really good draft. There's always the unknown, I mean, the pundits always love the Ravens draft, and more often than not, it ends up being true. But sometimes sometimes they whiff from time to time. That happens. But overall, yeah, we come away from this with the same big question. They address some of their other needs. Corner, I think they're in good shape now. I think that's one that they really addressed big time. As well as you can, obviously. But yeah, offensive line, and to be totally honest, Nestor, a week ago, if you asked me if they would have solved their offensive line problems in the draft, I would have said no, because they're picking 30th. That's the best they can do anyway.
And
So
they're probably going to
they didn't
take a
take one at 30.
corner, or to requote you, because I
Trade
like to
out.
hold you accountable, they were going to trade out anyway, right? So
Yeah.
anyway,
And by the way, they did. There were Eric DaCosta confirmed that there were offers, there were phone calls that they had to trade out, but they really like Nate Wiggins, and I think from a value standpoint and where they were, not just in 24, but really moving forward, I think they needed to take a corner. I mean, they first round corner they've taken since 17, and since then, over their previous 6 drafts, Brandon Stevens was the only corner they had taken in the first 3 rounds. So that shows you it was time to make an early draft capital investment at corner, and certainly Nate Wiggins fits that description.
see, people think Kevin Brown's the only one that can just drop musical references and that just, go. So I dropped a little Mary J in there. Hall of Famer Mary J. Blige. I got to throw that in before it's all over with. I'll get some foreigner references in for that crew as well. And I'll go through all the rock and roll Hall of Famers here. At some point, I'll write that letter to Eric DaCosta with all the Pearl Jam references that I've been putting together. But I'm waiting for the concert, waiting for Pearl Jam to get through the summer. We're rocking and rolling here. Our 25th anniversary has been celebrated in many ways, but the documentary has been the funnest, if that's a word, to put it through, because I like hearing John Stedman's voice, and I like seeing Art Modell and Art Donovan and Goose and some of the dearly departed people that have made up this journey over all these years. So if you haven't seen it, please go check it out. Throw me a little feedback on it. Thank my friend Greg Landry at Blue Rock Productions and Towson Transfers for making that happen. And if you have stuff laying around like I do, old VHS, that kind of stuff, that's the work that Greg does, in addition to making pretty cool movies and documentaries as he labored deep into the night to get that ready for draft weekend. And we can now get ready for the Yankees, Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, all that stuff going on here. Election coming up in the next 2 weeks. So make sure you get your voting done wherever you are in the state. We want everybody voting. And he's Luke. I'm Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570. Towson, Baltimore, football, baseball, pennant race, Yankees, draft picks. Springtime. Feels like there was no COVID, which is the way I like it. Stay with us. It's Baltimore Positive.